Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled, How is your AppSec program doing compared to others, presented by Denim Group. My name is John Palmero and I'll be moderator today. Throughout our presentation, we encourage you to interact with our speaker by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane. We'll be answering your questions following the presentation. You can click the green WebEx bar to access the chat window. We'd love to have you connect with us and keep the conversation going beyond today's event. If you'd like to join the conversation or ask follow-up questions on Twitter, the hashtag is AppSecCheck. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner. Also, we're recording today's session and we'll make the recording available 48 hours following the event via email. Now on to today's speaker. John Dickson is an internationally recognized security leader, entrepreneur, and principal at Denim Group. He has nearly 20 years hands-on experience in intrusion detection, network security, and application security in the commercial, public, and military sectors. As a Denim Group principal, he helps executives and chief security officers of Fortune 500 companies and government organizations launch and expand their critical application security initiatives. John and the Denim Group team consult with companies using the OpenSAMM model to strategize and build a software security assurance program. In the upcoming AppSec USA conference, John will be presenting the results of a research study Denim Group has been conducting regarding application security training programs. If you'd like to participate in this study, a link to the survey will be included in the follow-up email. In return for your participation, you will be entered to win one of 3 $100 Amazon gift cards. And now, John will present on the topic, how is your AppSec program doing compared to others? John.
Thanks a bunch, Nan. Again, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to jump on and discuss and learn a little bit about everybody's favorite topic, which is, of course, application security. And this particular presentation is focused on what we call maturity model, and that is a way for organizations to assess how they're doing relative to others, and in this particular instance, around application or software security. So before we jump into things, a quick introduction for myself and then also the company. Denim Group, we're a professional services firm that builds and secures enterprise applications very deep in both the secure development side of things as well as the security consulting around software development. We have done and continue to do multiple assessments around the OpenSAMM model. We'll talk about that in a second. And then we do a tremendous amount of training as well for PCI compliance mostly, but also for to instruct developers on how to create secure code. So that's our background. As far as me, application security person, have been in this particular field for nearly a decade now. Have been a security professional for nearly 20 years. I primarily spend most of my time helping CSOs and CISOs build and kind of push their application security programs. That is a huge effort. I'm an ISSA Distinguished Fellow for those that are associated with the International Systems Security Association, and I've done a bunch of these assessments. So I have the scars to show for that experience and can kind of show you and hope to communicate the good, the bad, and the ugly of software assurance activities. So that's my background, based in San Antonio, Texas, and I am ubiquitous at most security conferences. All right, the current state of affairs in application security is that, first of all, for better or worse, most organizations are still defining application security as scanning, and even more specifically as dynamic scanning. That's not ideal, but according to Gartner, about $500 million a year of a market is the dynamic scanning market. The web application market application firewall market is also very large, and then from there it kind of goes from there. So we always are aware of scanning as an activity, but we don't equate that with an application or software security program. The other thing that we still realize is that, and we see all the time, is that companies, organizations are using compliance as a key driver for doing software security embarking on a program, many times they're not doing it because they want to, it's because they have to. And that is they're not doing it to create secure applications because it's the right thing to do. They don't have a choice. And payment card industry is probably the best example of that. And so what you see across the board, depending on what industry and what company, is wide divergent strategies across multiple industries and companies. And that produces interesting results. In spite of PCI, in spite of compliance reasons for doing application security, there still are major, almost weekly breaches related to software security, application security. The interesting one from a few years back was the Heartland Payment Systems, because the particular attack vector was not a PCI-covered application, and for the record was not even really a critical application. It was of low value and not inside scope for PCI, yet it was the attack vector that the attackers used to leverage and get into the network. The Wall Street Journal SQL injection attack, really from last month, is another example, but honestly you could probably gather one frequently. So the challenge that organizations have is they're producing software all the time and in many different places, and it's presented in many different places, on the web and mobile devices. And really, the security of a organization is as good as its last build. And so that's the challenge you have. You have multiple builds, multiple devices, multiple location points. How does a organization create secure software in a repeatable way? And in this instance, how do you find out if that's happening? So the real key question today is, if you are charged with the responsibility for finding out what is in fact the state of the security of our applications, how are we doing? What are the practices? How does one tackle that particular challenge? One of the things that quickly comes up, certainly at the executive management level, is the issue of benchmarking. How are we doing relative to our peers? Again, I've mentioned that application security resources a lot of times are defined as dynamic scanning and WAFs. At least there's trappings of activities that are happening. But a real sophisticated CISO and AppSec managers, they really want to know how they're doing within even their sub-industries. So if you're an oil and gas company or energy company, you really want to know how you're doing relative to the peers that are in the pipeline part of that, or in the exploration side of that, of the energy sector, not the entire energy sector. And so, and the reason why is because increasingly chief security officers are getting asked by their external boards of directors and their executives, how are we doing? They want to know how we're doing relative to Shell if they're BP or Exxon. They want to know how they're doing relative to Wells Fargo if they're Bank of America or Citibank, for example. So the other thing they always ask, this almost always invariably the second question is, how much are we spending relative to these guys? Are we spending 40% more? Or are we under? So that is the start of a good dialogue with executives, and then typically you want to find out, how much are we spending, and then what type of activities, what are the artifacts of an application security program, and that's where OpenSAMM and maturity models come in general. So let's talk a little bit about what's called popularly as OpenSAMM. And what that stands for is the Open Software Security Assurance Security Model. It's an open framework that enables organizations to essentially look at their activities and their practices around software security, and also do some benchmarking. It's one of two popular competing models. The other one is called BSIMM. It's Building Security in Maturity Model, and that is one that was made popular and put into use by Dr. Gary McGraw of Cigital. So those are the two main ones that are out there. OpenSAMM is an open framework and was put out by the Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP, and that is obviously probably the preeminent group for software security in industry right now. There's many contributors, there's many people that author that, and it's been embraced by a whole series of companies, including some Big Four audit firms that have used that as well. So that's OpenSAMM. But what OpenSAMM does is it looks essentially at 4 business functions to understand where software security activities occur. Governance, whether or not the program itself is set up correctly and is tailored to the the compliance environment, construction, whether or not they're building applications and software in a repeatable basis in a secure fashion, verification, whether or not they're testing to validate whether or not that's happening, and then finally deployment. Are they at the very end? Are they taking it live? Are they checking it once it's live and making sure that happens? So there's really 4 areas, and under each of those 4 areas, there's 12 security practices. There's 3 each for each of those major ones. And what these then do is drill down into the different core areas that comprise governance, construction, verification, deployment. And for example, governance. So one of the things that if you're looking at an organization and its software security program, you're going to look at how it's implemented in the context of its business risk and business environment, and how they measure things and what they do around policy to take the compliance framework, the industry drivers, and then put that to work. And I'll give you a great example of an informal policy. Netflix. Netflix has a very fast-paced, a DevOps environment. Their culture is one of getting to market first, and so they do many builds a day, multiple builds, and what they do is, instead of going through a very heavyweight security process up front, what they do is they actually will deploy software and run a scanner, an application scanner in the live environment, and once they ID set of code or vulnerable application, they will tear it down in near real time. So that's an example of tailoring their governance practice to their environment. So, okay, so here's that's the OpenSAMM framework at a high level. Here's some of the good and the bad and the uglies of any maturity assessment, be it for applications, be it OpenSAMM, be it DSIM, or be it any maturity assessment. So one of the things, particular software, is that how do you infer the results across an organization if you look at a subset of the dev? Let's say, for argument's sake, you have 20 dev teams. You don't have the resources to look at all of them. What if you only have a chance to look at 3? What can you infer across that? And the challenge is, it depends on how representative those 3 groups are. Particularly if you've got a team in Denver that's doing Scrum and they're using Java, if you've got a team that's doing Android development and they're doing stream programming in Seattle, and then you have another team doing, for government contracting, CMMI-driven, waterfall development via, .NET in New York. I mean, by definition, the frameworks, the methodologies, the environments are so radically different. So that is a real challenge. And so we'll talk about that, but the challenge is then how do you, instead of going deep in certain ones, how do you then get a sense at a high level of what they're doing? That's the business argument for, instead of doing 1 or 2 deep, maybe you do lightweight assessments across all 20 to find out where your risk exists, for example. So the other thing is, the challenge when you deliver these is comparing apples to apples. If you have different assessors, it makes it a little bit more challenging. So you have to have some socializing of the data collection process to make sure that they're asking the same types of questions, and when they vary or they adjust or they adapt according to the environment, that they're still getting to the same core things. And I'll give you a great example of that is, when you have a client that says, yes, we're doing training, and we did like a lunch and learn, or we did a series of certain things, activities, the person that's asking the question has to know whether or not that's meaningful, and can then ask the second level of question. And that's where you can then make a qualitative judgment and say, okay, that's great, they did a lunch and learn, but they actually did a series of lunch and learns over a year, so that's a little bit more meaningful than a one-and-done lunch and learn from 2 years ago, for example. So the assessors have to have a standardized understanding. One of the challenges is it's still relying on interviews, and if we've learned anything in the security industry in the last 20 years, that is, you don't rely exclusively on what people tell you, you rely on what their network or application show in the form of technical vulnerability scans. So that's one of the downsides. And then the other issue is, like, how heavyweight is this process? Are you going to take a dev team off the line for a day, 2 days, a week, half a day? What is meaningful? What's the sample size within that team? And I think the standard happy medium right now is probably a day or a half a day, depending on the size and depth and breadth and complexity of the dev teams. But it sure ain't 2 weeks. It's probably not 2 weeks, just because no dev manager, no CIO in their right mind would take a dev team off the line for 2 weeks to do one of these interviews. So you have to understand, how do you get to the ground truth in the shortest amount of time in the most efficient way? And then the other thing is, again, security practices and technologies might radically differ between teams, and you kind of have to know a little bit about landscape. So when they start throwing out tools and they start throwing out processes, that the person interviewing isn't totally overwhelmed by that. And you have to be able to sort through that and say, okay, that's great that you're running Nessus. Nessus is a network security scanner that has limited application capabilities. Maybe we should talk more about that. So being able to capture and wave the flag of truth there is also a very important thing for the person interviewing it. And so many times the people that do the interviews at least have some software development background, and they are able to wade through the tough answers and get to a ground truth and ask the second set of questions. So anyhow, that's the challenge of any realistic maturity assessment. Then how do you what does it actually do? What are the levels, and how does one understand the different levels within those different business areas? So OpenSAMM has 3 different levels, and they reflect the different levels of maturity. And at the bottom line, at the very entry level, level 1 is able to give you some set of ideas that they're doing activities, whether or not they're repeatable, whether or not they're impactful, whether or not they've been measured. That is really something that also has to be normed within the organization and discussed. The other thing that's interesting about OpenSAMM is that you can tailor this, and the sophisticated organizations that do this and tailor it to within their environments, at least at a starting point, are able to say, what do you mean by level 1? What does level 1 mean to you? What does level 2 mean? And there's some level of agreement or socialization of these levels. The other thing that's realistic is that most organizations outside of the maybe NSA and the big banks are probably not remotely close to level 3. So they're probably at some level of level 1 or 2, and they're at the entry level. The interesting thing about OpenSAMM and any assessment model is you can tell real easily if they're not doing anything. So that's one of the things that comes up out of this is it's pretty straightforward how to identify 0, which is you have no, in the instance of governance, you have no formal governance plan, you have no policies, you have nothing. If you have nothing to show, a 0 is easy to quantify. When you get to 1, and the further you get away from 1 or 2, the harder that is to say, that's a 3. These guys are in the top 1% of what they do. Again, you put that in the backdrop of a complex organization that's widely dispersed, and it makes it even more difficult to ensure that it's done consistently. Okay, and then the different maturity levels, as I kind of got ahead of myself there, but 0 is a starting point. That means you're not doing anything, fairly straightforward to detect. And if an organization can't even represent that they've thought about it, again, if I use training as an example, if they've done no training, that's easy. If they've done some ad hoc training, let's say they did that one lunch and learn 2 years ago, that would probably be a 1. They passed around articles. They did an informal PowerPoint. They sent a developer to an OWASP conference. Okay, that's ad hoc. It's not repeatable. And oh, by the way, your 50% of your development team is new as of 2012. What have you done for them? Once you get up to level 2 and you're starting to see, again, depth, breadth, a little bit more capturing of the program, you can see that this is well thought out, that they're doing it in a consistent and repeatable way. And then level 3, the comprehensive mastery of these practices was involved particularly sophisticated and thoughtful practices. A great example in training would be, do you see that developers are in an Active Directory group, and then within 30 days they get an invite from their learning management system to consume this class. There's a business process and a workflow associated with onboarding. That's an example of, like, they have actually thought this through. Another example of a mastery would be 2 or 3 years into a training, an organization actually has reflected training objectives in the performance assessments of the development team and development management. I've seen that at several organizations. So they've gotten beyond, let's do a class or a series of classes. If a process is repeatable, it's part of their business process, part of their culture, it is expected. That's a level 3. And those are examples. So the interesting thing, this is where the uninitiated separate themselves from the people that have done this before. The real good people that have done this have field questionnaires, they have guides. They don't go in with a blank sheet of paper. They also don't go in with a script, because your ability to pivot and ask second-level questions and to understand it should be, if delivered correctly, a conversation and a series of questions that go back and forth, and you adapt off that. If you are perceived to be a person reading a checklist, at least my experience is, you will be summarily dismissed by the development managers and teams. So it has to be like an ongoing discussion. It can't be perceived as an audit either. That's the other kind of risk here, is you don't want them to go in and say, okay, here's great, it's that time of the year, here's our external auditors. It's viewed as something to help capture and help the development team. And again, so the style and the person that you have doing the interviews is very important, and that's the business case for having somebody that's done this before do it. Again, I'll go to, as an example of this, this is the governance side, examples of activities that one might do. I gave the training one as in-depth, but have a established strategic roadmap for software security within the organization. And then example activities, estimate overall business risk profile. I mean, capture the portfolio of applications that you have in your organization. I bet you half the organizations we talk to don't have a unified spreadsheet or some way to capture every bit of dev that they're doing. So maybe that start of that program is to actually catalog and do a census of every bit of software activity you have in the organization. And so that's a challenge. So these are the types of things you do. Then understand the compliance environment and tailor that to your development team. If for example, you have a HIPAA requirements because you handle health insurance information, what does that flow into the way you handle data at rest or data in transit in your application development? That's the mapping of those. That's what sophisticated organizations do, and that's reflected in the development processes they do. So those are 2 examples, the training and the governance. There's many more. Again, kind of the art of this is in those field questionnaires and how to deliver one of these in a way that appears to be consultative and conversational and is well received as on the developer end. So I'm going to wrap up here to leave some time for questions. Again, this is an effective mechanism to identify how your software security program is doing compared to others. The data collection and benchmarking and analysis are an important part of that. If garbage in, garbage out. If you don't do it well, don't expect great results. And then sophisticated companies are really doing this. They do, if you're not doing this, you might at this point be an exception and not the rule. But basically, sophisticated companies are conducting assessments and doing that, and they're using that to secure resources for further software security activities. So there's the incentive. If you're going to the CFO and CEO and saying, I need $150,000 for my AppSec program, and you have no trappings of data, or you have nothing, that's a harder ask than if you say, hey, we just did this and canvassed our teams, this is what we found. I think we need to go and dive deeper in this area because of the risks that we were able to identify. That resonates a little bit better with a chief risk officer or a chief financial officer than an open-ended ask. So with that, I will wrap up my formal remarks, and I have several questions that are coming in right now, as a matter of fact. So let me tackle the first ones. Let me encourage you again to pull up the chat feature. I think if you mouse over the little WebEx thing at the top of the screen, you can get the chat function and open that. Don't be shy. So the first question is, what type of background does someone have to conduct one of these OpenSAMM assessments? That's a hotly debated topic, but I will state my biases and my background, and then you can infer from that what you may. But I think you have to have some background in software and software security. I've seen some very effective InfoSec guys do this too. They don't have to be practicing developers, but they knew the right questions to ask. So you have to be able to get to that second level of questions. And what I mean by that is when somebody says, "Oh, hey, we're running SYNZIC Hailstorm," you have to know that that is a dynamic scanner, that it is kind of what it does, and then rank that in the kind of the larger scheme of things. If you've never even heard what SYNZIC Hailstorm is, that's probably a bad thing. So you have to have some context. You have to probably have a strong background in security and software as well. Okay, I have another question. This one from Montgomery, Alabama. Thank you, our friends in Montgomery. If you have multiple dev teams that are out there, let's say, and you are trying to infer results, how do you do that? Okay, again, I've given the examples. That's a tough one. If you've got a handful of dev teams, what I strongly recommend is instead of going and doing a deep dive in a handful, is instead to do a lighter weight assessment across all the teams. And then ask, instead of doing in-person interviews for a day, maybe do 1-hour phone interviews across all the teams. And that activity will help you identify the lack of artifacts. So you can ask a question about governance. Hey, what is your governance model? Oh, we have none. Oh, what have you done to map your compliance environment to your development requirements? Oh, we've never done that. What kind of training do you have? Oh, we've never done that. Okay, so at least in those lightweight or lighter weight assessments, you can identify the big gaping holes, and then that would be the business case for a second round. Maybe you go and look at those ones. Again, you're trying to reduce software risk across the organization, and if you just randomly pick 2 teams and do very deep dives on those and completely ignore the rest of the teams, you might get in that Heartland payment example that we threw out earlier, which is you're able to get great feedback on 1 or 2, but at the total expense of everything else. Okay, so we have another one that's come in here. Let me read that back. What are your thoughts on the merits of negative testing of things that apps are not supposed to do? That is a little bit. That is an important part of application security testing. That is probably, I would consider that a fairly mature evidence of a mature application security program. That's hard to do, negative testing, and that's what good pen testers and good application security testers are great at, is identifying abuse cases. And so again, again, the context of OpenSAMM assessments, if somebody is doing negative testing or threat modeling or something along that line, that's probably an indicator that they have thought this through and are doing some pretty cool things. So I would mark that as probably at least a 2, depending, or maybe higher, depending on the level of thought there of doing negative testing. I would give you an example along those lines. If they're doing just automated testing via dynamic scanners, that's one level. If they're doing that and then repeatedly validating those test results and then supplementing that with testing of logical or authorization rules or custom business rules, that is a higher level. That would merit a higher rating, for example. Okay, here's another good question that came in. Do you see in most cases that OpenSAMM assessments are conducted by internal audit rather than actual AppSec teams? I would argue that it's mostly by AppSec teams and external consultants. And the reason why is that internal audit people don't know how to ask those second level questions. And I gave the example of SYNZIC Hailstorm. I mean, they're the ones that would probably go through the questions in a serial fashion, a checklist fashion. I say that, but there are some super sharp audit teams that have application people. If you've got some context and you've got one of those, then by all means use internal audit. If not, then you probably want to go with somebody or augment somebody with expertise. Okay, we have one other question, and can you compare and contrast OpenSAMM and BSIMM? That's a real big question that we get all the time. And without going into a lot of the kind of background between organizations, BSIMM was created by Dr. Gary McGraw. It is closely affiliated with a company called Cigital and now also HP. That is, and they have created a very interesting set of data around that. They have a regular set of participants in that, and so there's some strengths there. Their comparative data set is very strong. OpenSAMM, much more looser, much more flexible, not affiliated with one or two organizations, is open by definition, a little bit more tailorable. The other thing is about OpenSAMM is it has less data. There are people that are working on that now, but it has less prescriptive data. I would also argue, my observation is that BSIMM and the BSIMM companies are typically the top 80 or so people that create, organizations that create software, the top banks, the top ISVs, the top enterprise clients. My observation is those BSIMM companies are doing some very interesting things. They are different than many of the companies outside of that top 80 group. And so the OpenSAMM is a little bit more flexible in that regard. And again, it's kind of a great standard that everybody else uses if you're not one of those two companies. But again, they're very aligned. In fact, Praveer Chandra, the person that wrote OpenSAMM, I think was at one time a Cigital employee, and I think it was originally funded by Fortify, the 1.0 version. So there's a lot of overlap within the two. But the key point between OpenSAMM and BSAMM is that if you've got to have the right people doing it, and you have to think through some of the questions that I threw out. You can poorly execute both of them if you have the wrong people doing it. And on that note, I think that I'm going to wrap up. We had some great questions. I expected some of those, a couple I didn't, a couple of curveballs, but thanks for everybody for participating. Again, we'll send out a follow-up email. If you're interested in participating in this application training study, we're trying to quantify the impact of training, AppSec training on a developer's ability to write secure code. If that's interesting to you, please don't hesitate, reach out. And again, thanks for carving out time. We'll put this recording up, and you're welcome to share it with your peers.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. You'll be receiving an email within 48 hours to alert you to the on-demand status of today's event so that you can review any material you missed or share it with a colleague. As John had mentioned, a link to the research study survey mentioned earlier will be included in that email. And again, in return for your participation, you'll be entered to win one of 3 $100 Amazon gift cards. Thanks for joining us today and taking the time to view this webinar. And on behalf of our speaker, John Dickson, as well as the team at Denim Group, we wish you a good day. Bye-bye.